Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. Today we're going to focus on tensions between Israel and Iran as both countries launch attacks against one another. Iran has launched missiles at Israeli cities today. Israel has struck deep inside Iran. Coming up, all the very latest. Plus, we ask, what next in this conflict? Hello and welcome. We take you straight to the latest on what's been a fourth day of deadly exchanges between Israel and Iran. Well, the health ministry in Tehran says that at least 224 people have been killed in the hostilities so far and that more than 1,200 others have been injured. Well, according to the Israeli Prime Minister's office, at least 24 people have been killed there, 592 others injured. This as both sides continue to exchange fire with barrages of missiles and drones hitting Israeli cities and towns. Whilst in Iran, a number of top military commanders and atomic scientists are reported to have been killed. Well, Israel says it took action on Friday in a bid to put a stop to Iran's nuclear and missile threats. We can speak now to Robert Fox, who is the defence correspondent for the London Evening Standard newspaper, who joins us from London. Mr. Fox, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Al Arabiya English. I just want to start by asking you, as a defence expert that you are, I mean, these claims made by Israel that Iran is on the brink of developing a nuclear weapon, nothing new. I mean, they go back to the 1990s with Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, other key leaders in Israel's past. Why can we be so sure that that Iran is as close as it apparently now is?
Well, frankly, I don't wish to be facetious or impolite. We can't be so confident this time, but we can look at the combination of circumstances that have brought things to where they are and why Benjamin Netanyahu took the opportunity of not say yes and not say no from the United States to go for an attack on Iran. And he's wanted to use a military option, or been considering a military option, we know, ever since 2011. Now, what's different this time was the remarks by the head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Authority, the UN body monitoring sanctions and other arrangements under various agreements, not least the Nuclear Anti-Proliferation Treaty terms with Iran. Now, the IAEA said that they had been cheated more egregiously than usual this time because they'd been prevented actively from getting to 3 sites that they regarded as crucial. And they deduced from that this is the IAEA, and Mr. Grassi, the director, has mentioned this, that Iran had been engaged in a game of diplomatic deception about what its intents were over nuclear, particularly uranium enrichment, whether they were going for weapons grade. And there is a general assumption, and it's not just Netanyahu's or Trump's or any of the Western allies of the IAEA, that they were going for quite a weapons program. And once again, we had very short timelines being offered that anything between 9 and 15 warheads would be ready for action well before the end of the year. And that was the excuse. And the thing that really fascinates me, exactly what was said before the attack was launched by Netanyahu to Trump and what Trump said back, because although Trump's support has been there, it at times has seemed quite fulsome, but not as fulsome as usual as you would get from Donald Trump. And he very much, as we hear from latest pronouncements coming from the G7 meeting, he wants it to stop.
What have you made of, I mean, obviously Israel saying it's got aerial supremacy over Iran. I mean, what's your assessment of how things have gone up until this point?
Well, they've gone with an overwhelming attack, rather devastating, from Israel initially, bombing the sites, including key sites of the nuclear facility, including the reactor above ground at Natanz. But it was clear from today that they haven't got the facilities that are known to be underground. And what was bothering the IAEA was the unknown. sites, and they were pretty sure there were some concealed sites. And I think rather unwisely, the regime in Tehran started boasting, saying, well, we've got new methods of enrichment, new centrifuges, we've got new centers for our nuclear industry, implying it was a nuclear military industry, which you don't know about. Now, I thought that was, even in terms of diplomacy, that kind of foolish boasting was extremely unproductive. Israel has managed to do a lot, but I think that the shock for Israel has been how vulnerable, not completely vulnerable, but the vulnerabilities, the holes in the air defense system and the sophistication of some of the weaponry that Iran is firing back and continues to fire back, namely ballistic missiles. Less worrying the crews and the drones, although the crews are worrying because low flying, sneaky, very difficult to detect. But the ballistic missiles, traveling many times the speed of sound, going into the high atmosphere, into space and coming down, and very difficult to track in the last moments of its trajectory, I think these are extremely concerning.
Which countries could potentially come to Iran's defense here?
That is a really tough one, because we know that Iran was in the middle of what the Western think tankery refers to with an appalling acronym of CRINK: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Now, I don't see Russia coming to Iran's rescue because it is under pressure in Ukraine so much from the war. And we know that this possibly means the supply, direct supply of Iranian weapons, including Shahed drones mostly, dries up completely. And Russia won't go the other way, although Russia, with the rising price of oil, benefits in a way. So the mystery one is China. China is one of the big powers in this, along with the United States, and it will want to be very careful. I think, although it's been buying huge amounts of Iranian energy products, I think it will be extremely concerned about the veiled or unveiled threats that have been coming from Tehran, that if things get worse, that they'll close off and mine the Straits of Hormuz, the outlet where 40% plus of global export energy that is for export on the world market comes. And a lot of that goes to China. So it is looking very complex at the moment. There's a hint through the Wall Street Journal report, unconfirmed, that our diplomatic efforts to the G7 meeting to regenerate the nuclear talks again, because it has been very, very damaging to the experience to Iran in only 4 or 5 days. But it's a very big country with a very large military and with very many different forces at work. There could be insurrections, may or may not be, but it will. What worries me again is the strategic planning, the options open to Netanyahu. What is his culmination point? In crude terms, the end game, but the culmination point is where military action delivers him, if I can put it like this, a result that he can really handle and be satisfied with. I don't see that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, what we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu on Fox News during the weekend was that the Iranian regime, as he calls them, extremely weak at the moment. I don't know if you would concur with that. I wonder whether you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu will heed that call as well by President Trump not to try targeting the Ayatollah. And I don't know why you think President Trump made that appeal, not directly, but it's come from a number of sources. What did you make of that?
I make quite a lot of it, actually. I think it's historic. I think that this goes with history, and it goes back to the early Middle Ages, that where you had arguments going from St. Thomas Aquinas right through to the Jesuits, and I'm being really serious, about the value, the efficacy, and the ethics of murdering a head of state or head of an enemy or antagonistic power. And the Christian theologians came up to a mixed barrel of answers about that. And it is a very serious move. There's been, it is very interesting that both Iran and Israel are very keen on decapitation. Now, in the case of Israel, we've seen that, you know, the kinds of things that they're recommended, particularly with taking out leaders of Hamas, of Hezbollah, I think it's productive only up to a point, because this kind of thing, if it goes wrong, can galvanize would-be neutrals or neutral opinion to support a national cause if they feel that the whole national fabric or culture is under attack. And going to Netanyahu's boast, I think while the penetration by Mossad and things like military unit 8200 has been absolutely tremendous, particularly with these Mossad-sponsored commando units, they cannot know everything everywhere all the time about the way that highly complex regime in Iran works. Least of all the ethnic components, the Azeris, but above all the Baluch. What can they manage? And it's the same thing that Russia actually faces in Ukraine, although it's much more straightforward. Can Russia really fully occupy a conquered Ukraine? Could Israel, with about 8 million population, really hope to dominate the whole territory of a very big country with 90 million population?
Okay, and just to wrap up, I mean, where things could go to from here. I mean, let's just go down the sort of the diplomatic route, you know, and end on an optimistic note. I mean, who could step in, and who would both sides listen to, do you think?
Well, it is clear that the key player is Donald Trump. I think he senses it, and he has been, I think, in his own terms, given the extravagant praise and the extravagant criticism often heaped on his head, he's been steering a pretty interesting course. He does not want this war to continue. He does not want world energy markets to be wrecked by this, which is in prospect. And if he sees in prospect, you know, the mining of the Straits of Hormuz, for example, he will really put the heat on. And I think he really can put the heat on Netanyahu, because those air defense systems, much vaunted, the complex, and it's a complex, remember, of Iron Dome, Arrow, and so on. It needs a lot of replenishment. It's very expensive, and that, the money, the armaments, the wherewithal, can only come from America.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you. Robert Fox, defence correspondent at the London Evening Standard. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's bring into the conversation Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who is a special envoy for the Israeli Foreign Ministry and a former deputy mayor of Jerusalem. Fleur, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us as ever. We are, of course, on day 4 of hostilities between Israel and Iran. Before we talk about that, I want to ask about something you've put out on Twitter about planes taking off from Tehran headed to Moscow. I don't know what your source was for that report. And I wanted to ask you who you think was on board those planes and where you see things heading to.
Well, the rumor was, and it wasn't a verified report, but we did get a report that Deputy Chief of Staff of Khomeini, Ali Asghar Hijazi, had packed his bags, and him along with some other IRGC people had headed for Moscow, which makes sense because that's exactly where Assad is and all the fallen proxy regimes that the Islamic Republic were actually supporting, aiding and abetting. And so it would make sense. We haven't heard anything since. It's a non-confirmed report, and I made it clear in my tweet, but it absolutely makes sense. We hear that a lot of the senior leadership is nowhere to be found. I know that from Iranian sources here who follow the intelligence of what's going on over there. And so we see that a lot of the government is seeing the writing on the wall at the moment.
I mean, that quickly, because it's only, been 4 days into this, into these exchanges of hostilities. I mean, that would be an astonishing rate of advance and a rate of change for this situation.
Well, absolutely, but you have to understand what we managed to do. So the main, I think, achievement is the power of surprise. They were completely surprised. It was day 61 of the negotiations that they were holding with the Americans that they weren't really very serious about. Trump kept insisting with them about no enriched uranium. They were not having it. They were not accepting it. And we really got them by surprise. On top of that, the Mossad pulled off something which I think people will be writing books about and doing movies about in the future. And that is how they managed to create a assembly factory of drones within Tehran, literally in their backyard. And those drones were what destroyed 25% of the missile launching capabilities of Iran on the first night. And so you have a lot of different events that occurred on the first night that basically cut their legs off. And then everything since has been a chaotic reaction. And so again, if you want to look at the success of this, and I don't want to call it success because we've lost lives here in Israel, we're under fire. I've been in shelters along with the whole country twice in the last 24 hours. And so there's no success until we manage to neutralize the nuclear threat against the state of Israel.
Just from what you're saying, I'm kind of curious, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer my question or whether you'll want to answer my question, but I'm wondering whether, as part of the element of surprise that you talked about, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's been a lot of speculation in the last 4 to 5 weeks about a sort of a rift between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. And I'm wondering to myself whether perhaps this rift has been somewhat artificially manufactured. What would be your thoughts on that theory?
That's a good question. And I actually was in an interview before the whole thing kicked off with Iran. And they asked me exactly about this rift. And I said to them what I'll say to you, we don't really know what's going on. And if you actually ask me for my assessment, I definitely think there was a sleight of hand going on. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu was meant to marry his son tomorrow night. So a lot of people said, well, he's marrying his son tomorrow night. What's going to happen? And I think he actually used that whole thing, the whole hype about the wedding he was holding for his own family member as part of this sleight of hand.
Okay, well, as you say, a lot of speculation. What we do know is that we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu at the weekend. He appeared on the US TV channel Fox News, and he was asked by the presenter Brett Baier about what message he would have for the Iranian leadership and what message he'd have for the Iranian people. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Mr. Prime Minister, very last thing. I asked you how long this may last. You said it's up to the Iranians. If you had the opportunity, and you do now, to speak directly to the supreme leader and to speak directly to the Iranian people, what are those two messages you'll say?
Well, the Iranian dictator, really, he's a dictator. He's a tyrant. He has sent us a message calling just about every day for the death of Israel, the destruction of Israel and America, but the death of Israel. So my answer to him is with action, not with words. But to the people of Iran, I say you're great people. You're people of great talent and genius. You have been usurped by this tyranny that has robbed you of hope, has robbed you of a good life. You know, I speak to the Iranian people directly. I don't know if you know this, Brett. I do these videos. I get millions and millions of responses. And they say, Viva Israel, bravo Israel, free us from this tyranny. And I say to them, your hour of freedom is near. Rise up, be free.
Okay, so a couple of things to pick up on from what the Prime Minister says there. But let me put a theory to you. I mean, we understand that 224 Iranian people have been killed during the course of these last 4 days of hostilities. I mean, there is an argument, isn't it, that by carrying out strikes that end up in the deaths of dozens of civilians, which these have done, in fact, what the Israeli leadership is doing is galvanizing support for the Iranian leadership. What do you make of that theory?
I don't accept it for a number of reasons. First of all, we know that 80% of the Iranian people want their regime gone. They've been suppressed by them. They've been brutalized by them. Women have been killed, men have been killed. The jails are full of people who just spoke out against their regime. And let's not forget, within the last 2 years, thousands of Iranians were killed or imprisoned by their own regime. And any casualty in a war, which is an innocent casualty, is a tragedy. And this is why Israel warned the people of Tehran yesterday to get out of the way, because it was never, and it is never our intention to target civilians. Not the opposite is what the Iranian regime do. They target civilian centers of Israel. It's absolutely the opposite. We don't want to target. There are always innocent casualties that are just the result of war. But I think the Iranian people are smart enough to understand that if you compare some civilian casualties as opposed to the thousands of Iranians, innocent Iranians that have been killed, brutalized and imprisoned, there's nothing to compare. And I agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We need to create the conditions, not just to neutralize the threat against us, but for the Iranian people to have their say, for the Iranian people to be free.
Okay, another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is sort of an extension of some of the points we've talked about up until this point. President Trump is reported to have expressed his will that the leadership, the top leadership in Iran, is not targeted. Do you think that was ever in the offing?
Well, I think that it's what's been reported. Prime Minister Netanyahu denied that immediately. Again, we just don't know what's going on behind closed doors. The way that we perhaps hypothesize that the rift was artificially created, we really don't know what's going on. All I know is that Khamenei is an avid tweeter that hasn't tweeted in 20 hours, so we don't really know what's going on.
As we've been saying, it's day 4 of hostilities. The Israeli President Isaac Herzog has been quoted as saying, "We had no choice but to attack Iran because it was rushing to a nuclear bomb," he said, speaking to Sky News. Do you think the Israeli public is overwhelmingly behind these decisions to engage militarily with Iran?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the Israeli public can really never really agree on too many things. We have a very avid democracy here, and there's always a lot of different opinions. But let me tell you, on this, everybody agrees that this is an existential matter for us. When people keep telling you they want to kill you, you have to believe them. And when those people who are telling you want to kill you is coming up with weapons of mass destruction against your country and your people, you have to take the threat seriously. We couldn't wait any longer. Netanyahu has been calling this out for about 15 years, and we literally got to the point when any further, they would have gotten to the point of no return. And Israel we don't have the luxury of letting them get to the point where they have a nuclear weapon pointed our way.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, Netanyahu, everyone remembers him in 2012 at the UN General Assembly with his diagrams, his show and tell. But, we had Yitzhak Rabin in 92 saying the same thing, Shimon Peres saying the same thing in 1995.
Yes. These are governments of left and right. That's
right.
why there's consensus.
But, here we are 26 years after, or 25 years after the death of Yitzhak Rabin. In fact, Israel is saying the same thing as it's been saying for a very long time. So why now?
Because from intelligence sources that I have spoken to, they understood that the pace of getting towards uranium for weapons was getting faster, and we were a few months away from that, and so we couldn't wait any longer.
Are you prepared, do you think, for a scenario in which there is a long, drawn-out, prolonged war with Iran?
Well, I hope we don't get to that, honestly. And the reports that I've been hearing today is that Iran is begging for a deal, begging now to abandon enriching uranium. And so I'm not sure they've got the capacity to go for much longer. We're also, of course, exhausted, we're tired. We've been in war since the 7th of October, which, by the way, was aided and abetted and helped planned by the Iranian Islamic Republic. And so We have gotten to the point, Israel is never a country that wants war. Every country that has wanted peace with Israel has found peace with Israel. And so we pray for the sake of the people of Iran and for our people that we find a way, or they get at least, the leadership that they deserve.
Before this happened on Friday, we heard comments from opposition figures in the Israeli political class and from commentators, people like Ehud Olmert, Ehud Barak, accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu of prolonging the Gaza war to maintain his grip on power. I don't know what you make of their argument, but as an extension of that argument, couldn't this be an extension of that very same idea of Prime Minister Netanyahu to stay in power for as long as he can?
No, I actually think quite the opposite. I think Netanyahu, look, he's been talking about this, like we said earlier, for 15 years. This is nothing new. Everybody knew that this was on the agenda, and everybody knew that Iran was inching towards enriching weapon-grade uranium. And so I don't think anybody believes that that was Netanyahu's aim, objective. In fact, you're hearing in Israel praise for this from all sides of the political map. Like I say, that's very rare in Israel. And in terms of Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, they're both bitter political rivals of Netanyahu, who have not had the successful longevity of Netanyahu's premiership. And unfortunately, they've gotten to the point that they want to burn the house down as long as they can burn Netanyahu along with it. So I wouldn't take them too seriously.
Okay, just to wrap up, what does the end game look like here, Fleur?
Well, if you're talking to me about an idyllic endgame that my Persian friends in the diaspora and my friends in Iran right now would like, is of course regime change, bring back a democracy. The Persian people are a people of democracy, of a tradition of education, of a tradition of development, and everything in the last 40 years has been pulled back to the Middle Ages. And so if I wish something for them, it's for them to be a free and fair society, which they can be, and for them to be an ally of the state of Israel, and together to change the region into a region of peace and prosperity.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. We're going to leave it there. Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring Mick Mullroy into the conversation. He is the former United States Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. He joins us from Abu Dhabi. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, as ever, here on Arabiya English. We've heard not once, more than once, the Trump administration quite keen to get across the point that it had nothing to do with the attacks on Iran up until this point. I mean, what do you read into this bid to try to put some distance between the US and events on the ground?
Well, Tom, I think it was clear that the Trump administration did want to get to a nuclear agreement with Iran, one that had to be more stringent than the 2015 JCPOA, but one that actually ended in a diplomatic resolution, at least to the issue of nuclear weapons. But once this started, and Israel did not only strike the nuclear facilities, but their military and economic infrastructure as well, I think the United States wanted to ensure this separation because of all of the assets that we do have in the region. Iran, before this started, said that they would actually attack if anybody attacked them. That didn't happen. That would have drawn the United States into this conflict, but I don't think the United States wants to be or needs to be right now, because they can see Israel had a very substantial overmatch militarily than Iran.
Okay, so why do you think Israel chose to carry out these attacks when the next round of US-Iran nuclear talks was just about to take place? It was supposed to happen on Sunday. Of course, it didn't happen. Why do you think Israel chose to act when it did?
Well, speculation, of course, on my part, but there's many who believed that Israel did not want to see another nuclear agreement between Iran and the United States. They were opposed to the 2015 agreement. This was looking to be very similar. The only question that they couldn't resolve was whether Iran would be allowed to enrich uranium in Iran. The United States didn't want them to. There was an allowance for that in the original agreement, but only to the level that would be needed for civilian energy. The U.S., of course, pushed for this multinational consortium where you can bring in enriched uranium that's already been enriched somewhere else. Iran wasn't going for that. So it might have been that Israel was concerned that Iran would fold on that, if you will, and get to an agreement that they didn't like. And I think that is a possibility that they went ahead and took the strike, because at least from my knowledge in public reporting, it wasn't clear that Iran had made the determination to get a nuclear weapon and was on the precipice of that.
But if that assumption is correct, I mean, is that the way to treat an ally? I mean, I can't imagine that sitting very well with the Trump administration, who, you know, President Trump calling for diplomacy, saying give diplomacy a little more time, and Israel deciding to, as you say, possibly, I know it's only speculation, but torpedo that diplomatic effort. I mean, how do you think that would have gone down in Washington?
I don't think it would have gone down well. I think they would have liked, again, to get to a nuclear agreement, and this essentially ended that. I don't see how Iran would come back to the table right now, any or the near future, with an idea that they would actually have another nuclear agreement. So I think that's probably caused some tension. There was reportedly tension between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu before then, but ultimately the United States and Israel are long-term partners. I don't see the U.S. reducing that at all, but this has probably caused some concern and maybe even some trust issues going ahead.
Would you have said that things were a little fraught even before Friday between the Trump administration and Prime Minister Netanyahu? Because there's been plenty of speculation to that effect.
Yes, you're right. And the reporting is there. President Trump would like to see the war in Gaza come to an end, for example, and they seem to have gotten no further than the Biden administration when it comes to making that a reality. It was clear that they wanted a nuclear agreement. This, whether it was intended to do that or not, it certainly did essentially in that as well. So there's probably some issues going between the White House and Tel Aviv. But I can imagine that this is something that will linger, but ultimately the relationship between the two countries will endure.
Okay, two things we've heard specifically come from President Trump in the last couple of days, or reported to have come directly from the president, I should say. First of all, he said, if we are attacked in any way, shape or form by Iran, the full strength and might of the US armed forces will come down like levels never seen before. I think he's referring to, for example, if a US base gets targeted by Iran, this is what the United States will do. I mean, do you see that as being a high-risk scenario? Do you think that's something that's likely to happen? And do you see the US somehow or other eventually being dragged into this?
Well, Tom, so before Israel struck Iran made it clear in statements that they would, even if it was just Israel that attacked them, that they would strike military facilities in the region. They didn't elect to do that. And I think that what President Trump is trying to do is send a message of deterrent. And it's getting backed up by the movement of significant assets. They're sending another. So there'll be a third aircraft carrier strike group, the USS Nimitz, I believe, that's being redirected from the Indo-Pacific. There's also a major flood of air refueling aircraft in an already packed region when it comes to U.S. military assets. So I think there's an idea that if Iran were to do that, they would essentially go from fighting a regional superpower, if you will, in Israel, to a world superpower in the United States. And that would be a strategic disaster for Iran right now. And so I don't think the U.S. wants to be drug in. I don't think they believe they need to be drug in. Israel's already established aerial dominance over Iran, did so in about 48 hours. They're hitting targets essentially at will right now. They don't need the U.S.'s assistance. The only thing that they would need the U.S. assistance for, I believe, would be to really get these massive ordnance penetrators, which are the type of munitions that, to my knowledge, only the United States have, that can actually reach down a considerable distance into the ground before they detonate. And that's how they would get these facilities like in Fordow, where it's up to 80 meters deep. I don't think Israel has the munitions. They can destroy the entry points, but they can't really get down that deep. I don't know that the United States would provide that to Israel, but that's one thing. If Iran attacks the United States, I imagine that would be on the table in retaliation.
One of the other things we've heard President Trump reported to have said in the last couple of days is that he is opposed to any plans to target Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That's according to a CBS news source, also cited by AFP news agency. I don't know if you think that's credible or not as a report. And I also want to ask, as an extension of that question, I mean, do you think that was ever part of the plan? Might that happen?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said very openly that he would like to see the Iranian people rise up and overthrow the regime. And it's clear that that's the message he's trying to get out there to the Iranian people. It's difficult to see that happening. It's a big challenge, of course, but oftentimes when a country is attacked, it actually rallies them, or rather than turns them against. It's still, I think, an objective of Israel. The United States, I think, is, if that's true, if the statement is true, is trying to send a message that they're not trying to completely destabilize the region. The Ayatollah, of course, is more than just a political leader, is a religious leader that could cause a wave of terrorist attacks. That would be my guess why they did not want that to happen. And I think they can see, as the whole world can see, just how good Israel is targeting leadership targets. They've essentially eradicated the entire general staff of the Iranian military, the IRGC leadership, all of the nuclear scientists that are working on these programs. They're very effective at that. And they probably assumed that they had a good idea of where the supreme leader was. And they didn't want to see that happen. They certainly didn't want to see that get tagged to the United States.
On Fox News, we heard the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying the Iranian regime, as he called it, is very weak. And we hear that there have been numerous arrests in Iran. Alleged saboteurs and spies have been rounded up. I mean, do you think that Iran has been? I mean, clearly it's been massively compromised. But do you agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu's assessment that the leadership is, quote, very weak?
Yes, in part. I think that's correct. They were not, of course, popular before this happened. The economic situation has gotten significantly worse in Iran, and now it's going to get even worse because they are targeting, again, not just military targets. They are going after their economic infrastructure to include their capacity to make energy and export it. That's going to be even worse for the people of Iran. They've also shown that they've had the ability to take many of them out. So they're not only weak, many of them aren't here anymore. And I think this is really showing the Iranian people that a lot of the regime's tough talk had nothing to back it up. They've essentially eradicated any capacity other than the ballistic missiles, which are eventually going to run out because they've targeted ballistic missile manufacturing facilities, and that will leave Iran essentially completely defenseless against Israel.
Okay, just to sort of wrap up this conversation, we heard President Trump at the weekend saying he was optimistic that peace would come soon. He cited the fact that he had managed to persuade India and Pakistan to come to the negotiating table and to cease hostilities. Do you think President Trump is right to be similarly optimistic in this case?
Well, in the case of India and Pakistan, they were both nuclear powers, or they are both nuclear powers. So I believe that they wanted to see a quick ending to that conflict because neither would want to be responsible for or have the fallout, literally, of an exchange of nuclear weapons. In this case, obviously not the case. That's one of the reasons why Prime Minister Netanyahu said he launched this attack to prevent them from being a nuclear weapon held country. So that I think, of course, we'd all like to see this end peacefully soon. It has caused major disruption in the region, and it's loss of innocent civilians being killed, likely on both sides. So hopefully his optimism is correct, but ultimately it's going to be a decision from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has said this is going to be weeks, not days, which means this could go on much, much longer.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Always a pleasure talking to you. Mick Mullroy, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, for more, we can speak now to Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republicans Overseas, who joins us here in the studio. Very nice to have you with us in the studio for a change, Greg.
Yeah, good to see you, Tom.
More used to seeing you down the barrel of a camera.
Right.
Let us start by talking about, what you perceive the Trump administration's desired outcome being here. We've heard President Trump saying he wants the two sides to strike a deal. He also told reporters at the weekend the two sides need to perhaps fight it out first. Which one is it, do you think?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both because, this is an anti-war president. He wants peace. He doesn't want to start new wars. But the mullahs, the regime, is not exactly cooperating with that. And by developing nuclear weapons, it was probably going to lead to more war, not less war. So in this case, the best outcome for the president is no war, but no nuclear weapons for the regime either. And those things are very consistent.
But do you think President Trump buys the Israeli narrative, which isn't new, that Iran is on the cusp of developing a nuclear weapon? I mean, they've been saying the same thing since the early 1990s, haven't they?
Yes, but I guess it all depends on what's your definition of cusp. And it looks like there has been a lot more progress made, and that's why the regime has done everything they can to keep from having any credible inspections and keeping from being candid or honest about it. So I think it just seems to be that the general conclusion is that this had to be done. This is not, Netanyahu or Israel trying to start another war. There's a reason that Iran has been, fired 400 missiles at Israel over the last year. And, this is not a proactive war. This is actually a defensive war. It's not preemptive on Israel's part, arguably. It's defensive because they've been fighting this war in some respect for 40 years, but definitely for the last year and a half since October 7th.
I've detected the Trump administration trying to put a bit of distance between it and what's been happening in Iran and between Iran and Israel. Saying we've had nothing to do with it, it wasn't us, we don't want to get involved, but if you touch us, we will. What's the thinking here, do you think? Is the plan to sort of perhaps come in at a later stage if that's required, or do you think there really is this perception that he's not the president of war, he doesn't want to get engaged in overseas war?
I think it's the former. I think, look, the president has a fine line here. He doesn't want to be seen as attacking Iran. He wants Israel to do that. He's probably very thankful that Israel is doing that because he wants to avoid greater conflict or bigger conflict. But it's clear that the U.S., and he admitted this much, that was assisting with some defensive mechanisms on Saturday and Sunday when Iran started firing missiles at Israeli civilians. So you saw U.S. weapons and U.S. intelligence assets being used by the Israelis. So look, there's cooperation. He's trying to ride the fine line. I think he's doing a great job of it. We're getting closer to an outcome. We just saw reports in the last few hours, as you know, that now Israel wants to get back to the negotiating table. It's interesting what a couple of successful airstrikes will do to someone's negotiating position. I think you're seeing that already from the regime.
Which do you think the Trump administration would prefer? A deal with a regime that it doesn't like, or a whole new regime?
Well, I think that's impossible to predict right now, but I would argue he would prefer a different government in there. Nobody seems to like the regime. 80% of the Iranian people don't like the regime. So, I think there's a lot of support for that, but we're not in the regime change business anymore. I think it's really important to stress that because it doesn't always work. Look at Libya with Gaddafi. There's so many examples of where regime change only really helps the people who like using weapons and getting the Americans involved in these things without having a real clear message on the outcome. And so in this case, I think we'd all love to see regime change. And again, the Iranian people, especially the diaspora around the world, would love regime change. But that has to come organically, it has to come naturally. If we can help the Israelis defend themselves, great. If we can help defend American interests in this region, great. But regime change is probably not in the cards for us. Let's hope it happens naturally.
Okay, and in terms of the health of the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu,
Yeah.
I mean, you could probably write books about this, even based
Yeah.
on, anecdotes from the last 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah.
The fact that President Trump didn't visit Israel during his regional visit in May. I mean, what do you read into all this?
I think I would actually suspect that he did that to make sure he didn't rock the boat too much in the region. You saw he was clearly reaching out to the Saudis, the Emiratis, of course, but I do think it's an unspoken bond between the U.S. and Israel. Many times it is spoken. It's quite obvious. There's no secret there. So I don't think he had to go to Israel. If that led some people to think that Israel might not get unconditional support from Trump, well, good, because that was great for the surprise element for the attack over the weekend. So, look, I think there's a lot of gray area here, but it's pretty clear. The president supports Israel and Netanyahu. You did not get that unconditional feeling from the Biden administration. The Biden administration kept holding back, or holding Netanyahu back, holding the IDF back, saying, don't cross this line, don't use these kind of bombs, don't use the 500-pound bombs. And that actually extended the war. It surely extended the war in Gaza. And so I think it's really important sometimes the best way to end a war is win. And the best, it's too late for preventing a war by preparing for war, peace through strength. That is something the president really believes in, but it might be a bit late for that in this case. So now it's just, let's win.
In this region here in the Middle East, obviously a lot of leaders are very uncomfortable about the situation right now. They have condemned Israel's actions targeting Iran. And I'm just wondering whether perhaps you would connect that to President Trump's desire to put across the image of being somewhat distant and separate from Israel's actions. I mean, is that how you would sort of?
Yes, and he's doing, for someone who's not known as a diplomat, he's being very diplomatic here. He's being careful not to sound too, fired up and let's bomb Iran, let's win. He's being really careful here. I think he's doing a really good job. I'm quite sure that a lot of the comments from other countries in the region is just almost required. It's just kind of standard. Let's de-escalate. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the same thing in the UK. We don't want escalation here. Well, great. If you don't want escalation, that's nice. But we also don't want nuclear weapons in the hands of a regime who stated that they want to obliterate the country of Israel and often chant death to America. So those are the kind of people you don't want armed with nuclear weapons. So, if you have to use some diplomatic niceties in your press releases, that's fine. That's all good.
So how do you think President Trump would have taken Israel apparently disregarding these calls for diplomacy, which President Trump has been making? Or do you think perhaps President Trump was sort of in on the fact that Israel was going to disregard these requests for diplomacy? I mean, which one do you think is more likely?
Look, I cannot tell you what he was thinking or what he actually said. There's going to be some things that are not public. But my feeling about President Trump is he is an anti-war president. In this case, the best way to get the regime to the negotiating table, which he wants, he said it quite clearly, and he said it many times. He said it even after the Israelis started firing on Iran. He said the best way for Iran to get to the negotiating table is get rid of their nuclear capabilities. And it looks like we're pretty close to that. So, this is a situation where he's, again, he has to ride both sides a little bit and be careful and be diplomatic. But I think he's done a really great job of doing that. And I would argue we are a lot closer to peace today than we were 4 days ago.
Yeah, well, that's what President Trump seems to be saying.
That's right.
He sounded pretty optimistic yesterday. He said peace will come soon. So you're saying he's right to be quite that optimistic?
Yes, because he's been so clear the entire time that we want to negotiate, we want peace, but the regime cannot have nuclear weapons. And that's why they chose not to negotiate. They rejected every proposal from the Americans since they started negotiating, and then, of course, didn't attend the session on Sunday in Oman. Surprise, surprise. Sometimes it's got to be a carrot, not just a stick. I mean, a stick, not just a carrot. And I think in this case, it's working.
I mean, they're saying Tehran faces the biggest breach of security, the biggest series of security failings since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. I mean, were we to imagine a situation in which there was significant leadership change in Tehran,
right.
I mean, how much of an impact do you think that would have on the entire region?
Well, I think it would be great news. Of course, there'll be some speed bumps, and this will be difficult. It's been, 45 years. I think the people of Iran are proud, super educated, super intelligent. You also have the diaspora that would probably, in many respects, love to come back and contribute and help. You've got the 16 or 17 intelligence agencies, none of whom are particularly fanatic or particularly supportive, or one or two might be supportive of the regime, but they sort of go along with it because it's just business, and a lot of people are making money. Not enough people are making money, but many are. And so there's going to be a realignment for sure. I hope it's sooner rather than later. I mean, we've again, discussing this since 1979, which should happen a lot sooner. But there's a lot of optimism. It's a great country. It's a great bunch of people. I have many friends both in London as well as in the US who moved in 1979. And I think there's a lot of interest in people going back and helping. I think it would be great for the region, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a huge amount of affection for Iran, for its culture, for its people, for its cuisine, for its literature, its cinema, so many aspects. And one thing I was, thinking to myself earlier, though, when we saw pictures of civilians being injured, killed in Iran, isn't there a danger that that sort of action, those sorts of images, are simply going to play into the hands of the leadership in Iran by galvanizing public support, really around them?
Yeah, so far it hasn't worked. And I think what you haven't seen this time around are the people in support chanting, marching or chanting in the streets, supporting the mullahs. Of course, in the past, most of those were paid actors in many cases, but that support is not there. I think they very well might be on their last legs. When you start turning on your own people, that's why you've seen more arrests, more imprisonments in the last year or so than you've seen in the past. It looks desperate, right? That's why they fired the 400 missiles. That's why they funded the proxy groups, Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis. And now you're sort of seeing the end. Syria, their puppet is gone, or Assad is gone. You've got a decapitated Hezbollah, down and out Hamas, and the Houthis essentially eliminated. Maybe they fired a few missiles in desperation on their sort of last legs, but it just doesn't feel like the regime is going to be able to hang on.
So it doesn't sound to me like you think there's a huge amount of reason to be concerned about an all-out conflict in this region.
Well, no, because I'm not concerned as much about conflict, because the Israelis have demonstrated that Iran is in a very weakened position. Israel has done, at least in the last 9-12 months, has had the upper hand. When they attacked back and took out some of their conventional positions, took out the air defenses, they have complete air superiority here. They know they have the U.S. behind them, and the U.S. has Israel's back. I don't think there's a lot of worry anymore. And I wouldn't have said this 3 weeks ago, John, or especially 6 months ago, Tom. It's that the regime has been weakened. So this whole World War III idea, I think, is just a bit of an exaggeration. I'm more worried about who replaces the mullahs, right? That's always the concern with regime change. And that's why I don't think you saw a collaboration between Israel and the United States to just march right in and change the regime. I don't think that's healthy. But yeah, of course, there's always going to be a risk that there's some volatility in replacing the regime, or that the next one could be even worse. I don't think that's the case, but that's always an issue that has to be considered.
While you're here, Greg, I wanted to ask about a couple of things related to US politics. Yeah. There's been a few events lately, quite shocking events. Yeah. Melissa Hortman, the Democratic leader in the State House, and her husband, Mark, killed in Minneapolis. John Hoffman, a Democratic Minnesota State Senator, his wife, Yvette, wounded in a separate shooting, a gun attack. I mean, what's your reaction to what's been happening? Well,
that's a horrible incident. The details are still coming out. We still don't know that much about the person who's, and thank goodness he's been caught, because there was a period there, Tom, where like the first day or first 36 hours where he was still at large. So I think the community was quite worried. It kind of reminded me of the Boston Marathon back in the early, back 10 or 12 years ago. But I think I'm glad he's been caught. Obviously, it appears, a bit of speculation, but there appears to be some mental health issues here. So I don't try to read too much into the politics right away, because this just looks like a really sad situation where someone with some issues took out some frustration. It really is. I don't think it's an epidemic. You don't see this very often. It happens. I'm not denying that. We've seen it in London. Several MPs have been killed in the last 4 or 5 years in the UK. We've had some political violence in the US. We saw some last week in Los Angeles. Nobody wants that. But this seems to be more, instead of a movement, this seems to be a real strange person that, with some mental health issues. And unfortunately, there were some real innocent victims here.
You say that, but I mean, the number of threats against US lawmakers is up quite considerably. Last year, there were 9,000 threats. And when you compare that to 1,700 threats in the year 2016, I mean, we've got a sort of fourfold increase in the space of, 10 years? I mean, that's
there's no doubt it's a divided country. And you also have social media that doesn't help in these situations. It sort of gins people up. You also have a bit of a mental health crisis in America. We've seen, a pretty linear relationship between mental health and the amount of prescription drugs that are prescribed on, especially on young people, and some of these incidents. So yeah, we've got, it's not perfect, it's not utopia, but I do think that this was sort of a lone wolf, oddball situation, not indicative of any kind of political trend.
We heard the president condemning the shootings, but he then spoke on ABC on Sunday, yesterday. He said, "I haven't called Governor Walz because he's a terrible governor who's grossly incompetent."
Yeah.
I mean, isn't he somehow or other contributing in a way to political tensions and divisions by making comments like that?
Look, I think the difference between this president and just about every prior president is he's remarkably candid. In 2015, when he started campaigning, many of us, Republicans, conservatives, we were surprised with the candor, and it was almost, he was saying things that we were thinking, but we were, in polite society, we didn't say those things. And people have been frustrated with the polite society mentality, where some politician says something really polite and diplomatic, and then he stabs you in the back later. And President Trump, he punches back, one punch, but he's also very candid. If you looked at the things that Tim Walz has said about President Trump, you would understand why President Trump didn't feel like he had to go through that charade of saying something nice to Tim Walz, when in fact, Tim Walz is a really bad governor. There's a reason people have left Minnesota at a pace only outpaced by Illinois and California. It's a very small state, and yet it's hemorrhaging people. And it's so I think it is a little bit of President Trump criticizing Tim Walz in a very candid way, but I think it's more that Tim Walz said absolutely horrible things about President Trump, and he's not going to reply with that kind of fake, artificial niceness when, in fact, everybody knows that Tim Walz has, called President Trump a dictator and a Nazi and all that other garbage. And so I think that, there's a lot of nonsense there. I think the president's probably frustrated with some of it, but on the other hand, he's completely candid. And it's that's why we have the most transparent administration that probably we've ever seen in the U.S.
Because you're not too concerned about extreme
not at all.
partisanship and hatred.
Not at all. I mean, of course, I'm a partisan. I don't like it when people or protesters vandalize buildings. I don't like it when anybody is actively trying to hurt police or innocent victims of any kind, whether it's police or it's just residents of, in this case, Los Angeles. So I think there's a lot of things wrong with what's going on, but I don't think that the president saying something unpleasant about a competitor or about an opponent is horrible if it's true and if he's just being candid about it. I'd rather see some candor and some honesty. I thought John Fetterman came out and was really candid over the weekend and said some nice things about the parades in Washington, about the 250th birthday of the United States Army. I think patriotism is back, and if that includes a little bit of banter and a little bit of competition between right and left, that's fine, as long as it's healthy and as long as it's not including violence, and that's what's most important thing.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good to
really
be here,
appreciate
Tom.
you coming to talk to us. Greg
My
Swenson,
pleasure.
Chair of Republicans Overseas. Thank you very much.
Good to see you, Tom.
That is all we have time for on today's edition of Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.